Welcome to another thrilling historical Western romance audiobook. If you're new to our channel, we invite you to subscribe and turn on the notification bell to stay updated with our daily releases of captivating historical Western romance stories. And if you enjoy our content, don't forget to leave a like to show your support. For our loyal listeners, welcome back. Excited to have you here again. Shall we begin? Act 1. The Long Road to Sundown Gulch. The wheels of the wagon creaked and groaned beneath Liza Caldwell, the steady rhythm a lullaby of sorts, though sleep eluded her. Every jolt in the dirt road sent a shudder through the wooden seat beneath her, rattling her bones. But she hardly noticed. Her fingers gripped the edges of her woolen shawl, pulling it tighter around her shoulders, as the cool evening air whispered over the open plains. The scent of sagebrush and sun-baked earth mingled with the acrid stench of the oxen, a mixture she supposed she'd grow accustomed to in time. Somewhere in the distance a coyote yipped, its lonely cry fading into the vastness of the frontier. Liza glanced toward the horizon, where the sun had melted into a fiery canvas of gold and violet, casting long shadows across the land. A bittersweet lump rose in her throat. Another day closer to Sundown Gulch, another day further from everything she'd ever known. She forced herself to breathe deeply, to quell the nervous flutter in her belly. She wasn't a child anymore, though some might argue she was barely past girlhood. At 20, she had lived enough hardship to age her far beyond her years. She'd spent most of her life in a backwater mining town, scrubbing floors and mending torn garments to scrape by after her father's accident stole his ability to work. When he'd passed in the winter, leaving her utterly alone in the world, she had clung to one last hope, an advertisement for a mail-order bride. It had been foolish, perhaps, a desperate woman's gamble, but what choice had she truly had? She smoothed her fingers over the crinkled letter resting in her lap, the inked words illuminated by the flickering lantern hanging from the wagon's frame. Dearest Miss Caldwell, I would be honored if you would accept my proposal of marriage. Life here in Sundown Gulch is a hard one, but I promise to provide for you, to keep you safe, and to build a good life together. A lump rose in her throat as she traced the neat, masculine script with her fingertip. Though she had never met Nathaniel Garrett in person, his words had painted the image of a kind man, a patient man, someone who had lost just as much as she had, and wished for companionship in this wild, untamed land. Her heart ached with a mix of nerves and longing. Could she truly be happy with a stranger, find love in a man she had never laid eyes on? "First time taking a long journey, miss?" The voice startled her from her thoughts. Liza turned to find the grizzled driver, Amos Tate, regarding her with a weathered gaze. His beard was thick and speckled with grey, his skin tanned and creased from years spent under the sun. "Or second time leaving home," she admitted. "Not that there was much to leave behind." Amos gave a knowing nod, adjusting his grip on the reins as the wagon rolled over a particularly deep rut in the road. "Mail-order bride, eh? Sundown Gulch ain't the prettiest of places, but it's got good folk. Hope your fella's one of 'em." "So do I," she murmured, tightening her fingers around the letter. The driver didn't pry, but his expression softened, as if he understood more than he let on. They fell into a comfortable silence, the rhythmic clatter of hooves and the rustling of the wind their only company. Liza let her gaze drift toward the other passengers huddled beneath thick blankets in the wagon bed. Some were families with tired, sleeping children nestled close. Others were men heading west in search of fortune, their faces worn but determined. Each carried their own burdens, their own reasons for leaving the past behind. For Liza, the journey meant more than miles traveled. It meant shedding the ghost of the girl she used to be, the one who had spent her life waiting for fate to take mercy on her. She had no delusions of grandeur, no dreams of silk dresses or sprawling estates. She simply wanted a home, a place where she belonged. As the wagon rattled onward, the last sliver of sunlight dipped below the horizon, plunging the land into twilight. Liza exhaled slowly, her breath a cloud in the cooling night air. Tomorrow she would arrive in Sundown Gulch. Tomorrow a new life would begin, and for better or worse there would be no turning back. The wagon jostled over a rut in the dirt road, sending a sharp jolt up Liza's spine. She clutched the wooden bench for balance, grimacing at the ache that had settled deep in her bones after days of unrelenting travel. The wind had turned sharper since sundown, carrying the bite of the high plains night, and the distant call of coyotes echoed across the barren stretch of land. Across from her, an older woman adjusted her shawl, the lamplight catching the fine lines etched around her warm brown eyes. Sarah Whitmore, a widow travelling west to join her son in Colorado, had been kind to Liza since the journey began, a motherly presence, the only one who had taken notice when Liza sat staring too long at the letter in her lap, gripping it as though she could draw strength from the very inked words. Sarah sighed, settling back against the creaking boards of the wagon. "Hard place, the frontier," she mused, pulling her blanket closer. "Some say it's a land of opportunity, but truth be told, it's a land of survival. Swallows folk whole if they ain't careful." Liza smoothed her skirts, her fingers trailing the rough cotton fabric, worn thin from years of washing in lye. "I suppose I don't have much choice but to make it." Sarah tilted her head, studying her with an expression that was equal parts curiosity and concern. "Mail-order bride, aren't you?" Liza nodded. "To a man named Nathaniel Garrett. He owns a ranch near Sundown Gulch." The name seemed to mean nothing to Sarah, though the woman's lips pursed in thought. "Can't say I've been there myself. Passed through these parts years ago with my late husband. Back then every new town looked about the same. Dust, saloons, and trouble brewing behind every swinging door." Liza frowned. "You think it's a dangerous place?" Sarah hesitated, her fingers toying with the frayed hem of her shawl. "All frontier towns have their share of lawlessness, but some are worse than others. Depends on the men who run 'em." She leaned forward slightly, lowering her voice as though the prairie itself might overhear. "That territory's been a breeding ground for outlaws since before the war. You got ranchers and homesteaders trying to make an honest living, sure, but there are others, ones who take what they want and don't mind shedding blood to do it." A shiver danced down Liza's spine, though whether from the cool night air or Sarah's words, she wasn't certain. "I was told Nathaniel was a good man," she said, more to reassure herself than anything else. "He's built something for himself, a life he wants to share. He wouldn't have sent for me otherwise." Sarah softened, reaching out to pat Liza's hand. "I don't doubt it, sweetheart. A good man is worth his weight in gold out here. But even good men can find themselves tangled in bad trouble." Liza swallowed. "What sort of trouble?" Sarah's gaze drifted beyond the wagons to the endless stretch of darkness beyond the trail. The fire from the lead wagon flickered, throwing long shadows against the rolling hills. "Some say cattle rustlers have been causing problems for ranchers down that way. Others say it ain't just rustling. Men are being killed, and the law ain't doing much about it." A slow, uneasy knot formed in Liza's stomach. "Just be careful, honey," Sarah continued gently. "A woman alone in a place like that, she needs to know who to trust and who to steer clear of." Liza bit the inside of her cheek, her heart pressing heavily against her ribs. She had no family to rely on, no father or brothers to stand between her and whatever dangers lurked in the shadows of her new home. She had no choice but to trust that Nathaniel Garrett was as decent a man as his letters had promised. For better or worse, she would find out soon enough. The wagon's wheels clattered over the hardened dirt road, sending up a cloud of dust that swirled like a restless spirit in the waning light. Liza shifted on the hard wooden seat, her fingers tightening around the edge of the bench as she craned her neck, eager for her first glimpse of Sundown Gulch. The landscape had begun to change as they neared the settlement, shifting from the endless open plains to rocky outcroppings and rolling hills dotted with scraggly juniper trees. The scent of dry earth and distant wood smoke curled through the air, mingling with the musky tang of the oxen. Liza's pulse quickened as the town came into view. Sundown Gulch sprawled across the valley ahead, nestled against the base of low, craggy hills. Bathed in the golden hues of the setting sun, it looked almost picturesque at first glance. Its main street flanked by rows of wooden buildings, their false fronts standing tall and proud as if they were built to impress rather than endure. The saloon, with its painted sign and second-story balcony, stood prominently at the heart of the street, its doors swinging open as a group of rough-looking men stepped onto the porch. A general store sat beside it, its wide windows reflecting the amber light, and further down, a livery stable loomed with its massive barn doors yawning open like a hungry beast. A church steeple peeked out from the far end of town, its weathered white paint catching the last glimmers of daylight, and just beyond it, a cluster of modest homes sat in uneven rows, smoke curling from their chimneys. It looked almost like the kind of place where a person could start fresh. Almost. But as the wagon rolled closer, the finer details of the town sharpened, and the illusion of charm cracked at the edges. The buildings bore the wear of years under an unforgiving sun, their wooden facades weathered and cracked. The streets, though bustling with people, were lined with deep wagon ruts and scattered with stray tufts of tumbleweed. A pair of dusty cowhands leaned against a hitching post, their expressions shadowed beneath the brims of their hats, as they took long drags from rolled cigarettes, their gazes tracking the newcomers with a mix of idle curiosity and something darker, something assessing. Near the saloon, a man shoved another into the street, sending him sprawling into the dust with a grunt of pain. Laughter erupted from the onlookers, though it held an edge, a sharpness that made Liza's stomach tighten. Amos Tate, still gripping the wagon reins beside her, gave a quiet grunt. "Well, Miss Caldwell, welcome to Sundown Gulch." Liza exhaled slowly, her breath unsteady as her eyes took in every detail. This was it. A new home, the place where she would be married, where she would build a life with a man she had never met. A warm gust of wind kicked up a swirl of dust, catching the hem of her skirt and tugging at the loose curls framing her face. She fought the urge to tuck them back, her fingers trembling slightly as she clutched the folds of her dress instead. Somewhere in this town, Nathaniel Garrett was waiting for her. A man whose words had promised kindness, stability, a future, and yet, as she looked down the street, past the faces of strangers, past the saloon doors that swung open to reveal more men with sharp gazes and knowing smirks, past the sheriff's office where a single lantern burned in the growing dusk, a deep unease settled in her chest. This was not a town for the faint of heart. She would have to tread carefully, because promise and peril walked hand in hand in Sundown Gulch, and Liza had no choice but to step forward and meet them both. The wagon lurched to a stop, sending a final bone-jarring jolt up Liza's spine. Dust swirled in the golden morning light, kicked up by the wagon wheels and the steady movement of people, horses and livestock, navigating Sundown Gulch's bustling main street. The scent of hot earth, leather, and something fried wafted through the air, mixing with the acrid tang of sweat and manure. Liza pressed a hand to her stomach, willing away the nervous flutter that had settled deep inside her. The ride had been long, the nights cold, and her body ached from days of travel, but none of that compared to the heavy anticipation pressing against her ribs now. This was it. Her new home. She gathered the folds of her skirt in one hand and stepped carefully down from the wagon, the rough wood of the step biting through her worn leather boots. The moment her feet hit solid ground, the weight of her decision settled over her with undeniable finality. There was no turning back. She lifted her chin, taking in the town in the full light of day. Sundown Gulch was alive with movement. Merchants had set up makeshift stalls in front of the general store, shouting out prices for sacks of flour and jars of molasses, while a grizzled old man peddled sharpened knives from a wooden cart. A trio of women in faded calico dresses chatted near the boarding-house steps, their hands busy shelling peas into a large wooden bowl. A dusty-haired boy darted past her, chasing after a stray chicken with his arms outstretched, his laughter ringing through the air. The energy of the town pulsed around her, both familiar and foreign, both welcoming and foreboding. A pair of long-horned cattle lumbered lazily through the square, their handler barking half-hearted commands as they meandered dangerously close to the saloon porch. A group of cowhands lounged nearby, their boots propped on the hitching post as they watched the town with unreadable expressions. It was rougher than she'd imagined. No white picket fences, no neatly swept storefronts. Sundown Gulch was raw, unpolished, alive. "Miss Caldwell?" The voice came from her left, and Liza turned to find a stocky man striding toward her, his hat gripped tightly in one calloused hand. He was older, with a full head of greying hair and deep lines bracketing his mouth, though his blue eyes were kind. "Yes," she said, her voice steady despite the nerves dancing through her. "I'm Liza Caldwell." He gave her a warm, if slightly wary smile. "Welcome to Sundown Gulch. Name's Ed Barnes. I work for Nathaniel Garrett." Relief coursed through her, and she exhaled slowly. This was the first true connection she had to Nathaniel, the first thread tying her to her new life. "I'm pleased to meet you, Mr. Barnes." "Likewise, ma'am." He adjusted his stance, glancing briefly around before gesturing toward a nearby bench beneath the awning of the general store. "Travel must have been long. Why don't we sit a spell?" Liza nodded and followed him, lowering herself onto the wooden bench. The wood was warm from the morning sun, and she welcomed the moment to gather herself. "Nathaniel sent me to fetch you, but—" Ed hesitated, rubbing the back of his neck. His gaze flicked to her face, measuring, weighing. "There's been a change of circumstances." Liza's pulse stuttered. "Change?" she repeated, gripping her hands together in her lap. Ed exhaled through his nose, his face tightening with something that looked an awful lot like regret. "I'd rather not go into it here. Let's just say things didn't go as planned." A chill crept down her spine despite the warmth of the sun. Before she could press for more details, a new voice interrupted. "Well, I'll be another one of Garrett's mail-order brides." Liza turned toward the sound, her gaze landing on a middle-aged woman with a wiry frame and a sharp, bird-like face. She wore a faded brown dress, an apron smudged with flour, and her hair was pinned back in a severe knot. Ed scowled. "Now, Marcy—" "I mean no disrespect," Marcy said, though the glint in her eyes suggested otherwise. She wiped her hands on her apron and looked Liza up and down, not unkindly but not warmly either. "Just that we don't see many young ladies willing to tie themselves to this town without a good reason." Liza squared her shoulders, meeting the woman's gaze head-on. "A good life is reason enough." Marcy's lips twitched, as though she found the answer amusing. "Well, you've got grit, I'll give you that." Her gaze flicked to Ed. "Are you taking her to the ranch?" Ed hesitated, just long enough for Liza to notice. "In a bit." Marcy snorted, shaking her head. "Well, best you get settled, Miss Caldwell. Sundown Gulch ain't the worst place a woman could end up, but it sure as hell ain't the best, neither." With that, she turned on her heel and strode back toward the bakery, leaving behind the scent of yeast and cinnamon in her wake. Liza let out a slow breath. Ed Barnes stood, dusting his hands off on his trousers. "Come on, Miss Caldwell, let's find you something to eat before we ride out." Eliza nodded, but her mind was spinning. A change of circumstances, a town filled with unspoken warnings, a groom she had yet to meet. As she followed Ed toward the cafe, a weight settled in her chest. Something told her Sundown Gulch wasn't just a town of new beginnings. It was a town of secrets, and she had just stepped right into the heart of them. Liza stepped through the doorway of the modest house, her boot heels clicking softly against the wooden floor. Sunlight filtered through the lace curtains, casting intricate patterns on the worn pine planks. The scent of fresh bread and lavender lingered in the air, mixing with the faint, sweet aroma of beeswax polish. It was not grand, nor was it a fine mansion befitting a man of wealth, but it was warm, lived in, a place where a home could be built, where a life could begin. The room was simply furnished. A sturdy wooden table with chairs that had been lovingly repaired more than once, a cast-iron stove tucked into the corner, and a comfortable-looking settee against the wall. A patchwork quilt, well used but clean, draped over the armrest, and a stack of neatly folded linen sat on a nearby shelf. Ed Barnes, who had accompanied her from town, set her trunk down near the door, wiping a bead of sweat from his brow. "This here's the place Nathaniel was fixin' up for you," he said, glancing around with a nod of approval. "Ain't the biggest house in these parts, but it's solid, sturdy, like everything he built." Liza caught the past tense in his words and turned toward him, heart stuttering. "Built?" A shadow crossed Ed's face, but before she could press him, he cleared his throat. "Nathaniel wanted to make sure you had a home ready before you arrived, wanted you to be comfortable." He gestured to the small chest against the far wall. "He even had a few things ordered special for you." Curious, Liza crossed the room and lifted the lid. Inside were neatly folded dresses in soft earth tones, more than she'd ever owned in her life. There were hair ribbons, finely woven stockings, even a pair of delicate gloves embroidered with tiny blue flowers. Her throat tightened at the sight of them. She brushed her fingers over the fabric, feeling the care behind the gesture. This was not a man who had sent for a bride simply to have a woman cook his meals and warm his bed. She turned to Ed, questions dancing on the tip of her tongue, but his expression gave nothing away. "I'll leave you to settle in," he said, shifting his hat onto his head. "You'll find everything you need here, food in the pantry, a few supplies in the cabinet. If you need anything, Miss Marcy from the bakery ain't shy about helping newcomers find their footing." Liza offered him a grateful smile, though unease still stirred in her belly. As Ed stepped out, the door clicking shut behind him, silence settled over the house. Liza let out a slow breath and turned in a slow circle, taking in the space that was meant to be hers. A cautious hope bloomed inside her chest, tentative and uncertain, but present nonetheless. Could she truly belong here? She crossed to the small writing desk tucked beside the window and ran her fingers over its smooth, polished surface. A chair sat neatly beneath it, a simple inkwell resting beside a bound leather journal. Liza hesitated only a moment before lowering herself into the chair, brushing the dust from the book's cover. She had always loved writing, though she rarely had time for it in her old life. It had been a way to capture her dreams, her fleeting hopes. A private place to speak the words she never dared to say aloud. She dipped the quill into the ink and pressed the tip to the page, her hand steady despite the flurry of emotions twisting inside her. "This is my new home. I do not know what tomorrow will bring, but I am grateful for today. Nathaniel Garrett has been thoughtful in ways I did not expect. Perhaps life here will not be so lonely after all." She paused, tapping the feathered end of the quill against her chin. The words felt small, inadequate. They did not capture the shift within her, the way her heart had dared to unfurl just a little in this strange place. She turned her gaze out the window, watching as the last light of day bathed the fields in hues of gold. Beyond the small fenced yard, the land stretched wide and free, untamed and full of possibility. Liza had never owned anything before. She had never had a place to call her own. For the first time since she had arrived in Sundown Gulch, she let herself believe. Maybe she could make a home here. Maybe, just maybe, she had finally found where she was meant to be. She dipped the quill again and wrote one last sentence before setting the journal aside. "Tomorrow I will be brave." And for the first time since she had stepped off that wagon, Liza Caldwell truly meant it. The porch creaked beneath Liza's weight as she settled onto the wooden step, wrapping her shawl tightly around her shoulders. The night air carried a crisp bite, chasing away the lingering warmth of the day, but she welcomed the chill. It cleared her mind, sharpened her senses, made her feel awake in a way she hadn't since stepping off that wagon. Above her, the vast expanse of sky stretched wide and endless, jeweled with countless stars. They blinked and shimmered like tiny promises against the inky blackness, each one a whisper of something more, something bigger than herself, bigger than this town, bigger than all the uncertainty weighing on her shoulders. She tipped her head back, drinking it in. Liza had always loved the stars. Back home, her old home, she corrected, she would lie on the small cot in the attic, staring up at the patch of sky visible through the cracked wooden slats of the roof, imagining A different life. A better life. A life where she wasn't alone. She exhaled softly, watching as her breath formed a pale mist in the cool air. Would this place give her the life she had long dreamed of? Would Sundown Gulch be kind? Or would it break her, like so many before her? Somewhere in the distance, a coyote let out a lonely wail, its cry echoing through the rolling hills. A horse whinnied in response from a nearby paddock, and the quiet murmur of the town carried on the breeze. The occasional clatter of boots against the boardwalk, a door swinging shut, muffled voices spilling from the saloon before the night swallowed them again. It was strange, this new town, rough around the edges, weathered by time and hardship, but full of life in a way that made her chest ache. There was a pulse to it, an untamed energy. And somewhere in this town, her future was waiting. Nathaniel Garrett. But he was gone now, and she was here, alone. Her fingers tightened on the fabric, and she forced herself to breathe deeply. She wasn't the kind of woman who allowed despair to take root. She'd survived too much, fought too hard to crumble now. She'd come to Sundown Gulch seeking a future, and she would find one. It might not be the future she had envisioned, with a husband waiting at the end of the aisle and a ready-made home filled with love and laughter, but she would build something for herself. Maybe she'd find work at the general store. Maybe she'd learn to ride a horse or bake bread in the kitchen she now called her own. Maybe, just maybe, she'd meet someone who would look at her with the same warmth and kindness she'd imagined in Nathaniel's letters. The thought sent a small shiver through her, and she couldn't tell if it was fear or something else entirely. She glanced down at her hands, at the faint ink stains smudged on her fingertip from earlier when she had written in her journal. "Tomorrow I will be brave," the words echoed in her mind, grounding her, steadying her. Tomorrow she would wake up in this little house and begin again. Tomorrow she would take her first steps toward whatever fate had in store for her. But tonight she would sit here beneath the stars, listening to the quiet hum of a town not quite asleep, and dream. She let out a slow breath, her gaze lifting to the sky once more. A shooting star streaked across the heavens, swift and fleeting, gone before she could even think to make a wish. But she made one anyway, and as the night stretched on, as the town quieted and the stars blinked in silent witness, Liza allowed herself the smallest, most fragile sliver of hope. Maybe, just maybe, her wish would come true. The morning sun spilled through the lace curtains, casting warm golden patterns across the wooden floor. Outside, the town of Sundown Gulch was waking, the sound of booted footsteps echoing against the boardwalk, the distant clang of a hammer striking metal from the blacksmith's forge. Somewhere down the street, a woman called out a cheerful greeting, and a wagon rumbled past, its wheels kicking up dust. It should have been a day of quiet excitement, a day filled with soft smiles, the rustle of fabric as she smoothed out her dress, the lightness in her chest as she prepared to stand beside the man who had promised her a future. Instead, a cold dread coiled in Liza's stomach. She had been awoken before dawn by a firm knock at the door, and Ed Barnes' voice had carried through the wood, hushed and urgent. "Miss Caldwell, you'd best come with me. There's news." Those words had soured in her stomach like curdled milk. Now She sat stiffly in a chair inside the dimly lit back room of the town hall, her gloved hands folded in her lap, her fingers pressing into the fabric as though she could hold herself together with sheer will. Across from her, 3 men and 1 woman sat in a solemn row, faces lined with worry, voices barely rising above a whisper as they exchanged glances that said more than their words ever could. "Miss Caldwell," Sheriff Tom Granger finally said, his voice as rough as the stubble on his weathered jaw. He was a broad-shouldered man, his hat resting on his knee, his face pinched in a way that made her stomach tighten further. "I'm sorry you had to learn it like this, but Nathaniel Garrett won't be coming for you." Liza's breath hitched, her mind fumbling over the meaning. Completely in charge, her fingers clenched together. Is he ill? Silence. Not one of them met her eyes. Her heart pounded against her ribs, a wild, panicked drumbeat. It was the woman, Eleanor Garrett, Nathaniel's aunt, who finally spoke. She was a tall, elegant woman with silver threaded through her dark hair, her fine features drawn tight. "My nephew is dead, Miss Caldwell," she said softly, her voice trembling slightly. "Murdered?" Liza's body went still, so still she thought she might shatter. "Dead." "Murdered!" The words sliced through her, sharp and unrelenting. A ringing filled her ears, drowning out the creak of a chair shifting, the measured scrape of the sheriff's boot against the floor. The world blurred at the edges, as if everything had tilted sideways, and for a moment all she could hear was the sound of her own heartbeat, hammering in her chest like a bird trapped in a cage. She forced herself to breathe. That can't be right." "I'm afraid it is." Eleanor's voice was gentle but firm, her lips pressed into a thin line, her hands clasped tightly together, as though she too was holding herself upright. "Nathaniel was found 3 nights ago, just outside of town, shot in the back." Lisa's breath shuddered out. 3 nights ago. He had been dead before she even arrived. "I don't understand," she whispered, barely recognizing her own voice. "Who would do such a thing?" The men shifted uncomfortably. "That's what we aim to find out," the sheriff said. "But the trail's already gone cold. No witnesses." "No one saw a thing." "No one ever does," muttered one of the men. Mayor Wilkes, a stout man with a permanently furrowed brow. His fingers drummed against the tabletop. "Damn town's getting worse by the day." Eleanor shot him a sharp look before turning back to Liza. "Nathaniel had enemies," she admitted, hesitating for a fraction of a second. "All men of means do, I suppose." Liza's gaze flickered to the older woman's face, searching for something, anything, that might make sense of this. But Eleanor's expression was unreadable. "Nathaniel had enemies." The words sat uneasily in her mind, but she had no way of knowing whether they were the careful deflections of a grieving family member or the first whisperings of something far darker. Her throat was dry, but she forced the next words out. "And what happens now?" The room was quiet for a beat too long. "Miss Caldwell," the sheriff said at last, his tone carefully measured, "I understand this must be difficult. You came here expecting a new life, a husband to take care of you, and now, well, the circumstances have changed. Changed." She nearly laughed at the absurdity of it. Her entire future had vanished before it had even begun. "We don't want to send you off with nothing," Eleanor added, her voice softer now, regretful. "Nathaniel wanted you here. If you'd like, you can stay, at least until you figure out what you want to do next." Liza swallowed. Stay. Stay in a town where her betrothed had been murdered in cold blood. Stay in a place where, it seemed, no one wanted to speak too loudly about the truth. She wanted to run. Wanted to board the first wagon out of Sundown Gulch and leave this nightmare behind. But where would she go? Back to a town where no one waited for her? Back to a life of scrubbing floors and empty nights? Her fingers curled into the fabric of her skirt. No. She had come here for a future. Nathaniel might be gone, but she was still here, and someone in this town knew why he was dead. She lifted her chin, ignoring the way her hands trembled, the way her heart pounded. "I'll stay," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. The sheriff gave her a long look, then nodded. "All right, then." Eleanor reached for her hand, giving it a firm squeeze. "I'll make sure you have what you need." Lisa only nodded, barely feeling the touch. She was no longer a bride waiting for her groom. She was a woman standing at the edge of a life she hadn't planned for, and whether she liked it or not, she had just taken her first step into a world far more dangerous than she had ever imagined. The world felt heavier than it had moments before. Lisa walked blindly out of the town hall, her feet moving on their own, the voices of the elders and Sheriff Granger still echoing in her ears. "Nathaniel Garrett is dead! Murdered!" The words clawed at the edges of her mind, but she couldn't let them in yet, not fully. If she did, she might fall apart completely, and she could not afford that. Not here. Now. The sun was high, burning fiercely above Sundown Gulch, but she felt cold all over. She walked without purpose down the main street, past the storefronts, past the clusters of people moving about their day as if nothing had changed, as if the man she had come to marry had never existed at all. Some people watched her, not with cruelty, but with something just as piercing, pity. A lump formed in her throat, thick and unbearable. She could taste the sting of humiliation on her tongue. The town already knew, of course they did. A murder in a place like this didn't stay quiet, and neither did the fate of a foolish girl who had travelled miles across the country to wed a man who was already 6 feet under by the time she arrived. She turned off the main road, her boots kicking up dust as she made her way toward the outskirts of town. She didn't know where she was going, she just knew she had to get away. A world that no longer fit the last of the buildings fell away behind her, replaced by the barren, open stretch of land that framed the town like an endless dry sea. The wind had picked up, carrying the scent of dust and sagebrush, tangling her hair around her face. Her breaths came sharp, uneven. She had believed in this. She had believed in Nathaniel Garrett, in the life he had painted with his words. His letters had been full of quiet kindness, of plans for a future where they would work the land together, where they would build something lasting. She had dared to hope for love, even if it had not yet been there. She had packed her few belongings, left behind the only life she had ever known, stepped onto that wagon with the reckless courage of a woman who had nothing to lose. And still, somehow, she had lost everything. Her fingers curled into the fabric of her skirt, gripping tightly as though she could hold herself together by sheer will. She wanted to scream. She wanted to cry, to crumble, to sink into the dust beneath her feet and disappear. But she did none of those things. Instead, she pressed a hand to her chest, as if she could physically push back the pain, and stared out at the emptiness before her. It stretched wide and endless. So much space, so much nothing. Just like her future. A bitter laugh clawed its way up her throat, but she swallowed it down. She was alone. Alone in a town that wasn't hers. Without a home, without a husband, without a single soul to turn to. A gust of wind whipped through the valley and something caught her eye. A flicker of white tumbling over the dry earth. Liza blinked, watching as the wind carried it closer. A folded piece of paper, dirt-streaked, edges curling. She knelt slowly, her skirts pooling around her as she reached for it with trembling fingers. A discarded wedding invitation. She smoothed it open, her eyes tracing the faded ink, the names printed in careful script. Nathaniel Garrett and Liza Caldwell. February 2nd, 1882, her wedding day. Today. A soft, broken sound slipped from her lips, barely more than a breath. The wind tugged at the paper, but she held it fast, her thumb brushing over Nathaniel's name. He was gone. Everything she had pinned her hopes on was gone, and all she had left was this, a ghost of a promise never kept, a reminder of what would never be. Her fingers slackened, and the wind stole it from her grasp. She watched it dance across the barren land, tumbling, twisting, until it disappeared into the distance, just like her dreams, just like everything she had thought she was coming here to find. And for the first time since stepping off that wagon, Liza let the first tear fall. The saloon was dim, its air thick with the scent of stale beer, pipe smoke, and the faint lingering musk of sweat-soaked bodies. Even this early in the evening, the place hummed with subdued energy. Men hunched over whiskey glasses, murmuring in low tones, the occasional burst of laughter ringing hollow against the walls. Liza hesitated in the doorway, fingers curling tightly around the small reticule at her side. She had never stepped foot inside a saloon before. Women like her, proper women, did not frequent such places. And yet she was here because Nathaniel Garrett was dead, because no one seemed willing to talk about it, because if she wanted answers she would have to find them herself. Squaring her shoulders, she stepped inside, her boots clicking softly against the scuffed wooden floor. The bartender glanced up, his expression wary as he wiped his hands on a rag. His shirt sleeves were rolled up to his elbows, exposing thick forearms dusted with dark hair. He was older, his hair greying at the temples, his face lined with years of watching and listening, and, if her instincts were correct, keeping secrets. He leaned forward slightly as she approached, resting his elbows on the counter. "Even in, miss. This ain't exactly the kind of place for a lady." Liza forced a polite smile, though her stomach twisted with nerves. "I'm not here for trouble, just looking for information." The bartender's gaze flickered past her, toward the men scattered throughout the saloon, then back to her. His mouth pressed into a tight line. "Then so." She nodded, placing a few coins on the counter. "Nathaniel Garrett?" His expression didn't change, but she noticed the slight tensing of his jaw. "What about him?" "I need to know what really happened to him," she said quietly. "And I have a feeling you know more than what the sheriff's telling me." A muscle ticked in his cheek. "Ain't my place to speak on that." "But you know something," she pressed. The bartender exhaled through his nose, shaking his head. "Miss, let me give you some advice. There's things in this town best left alone." Her pulse pounded in her ears. "Like murder?" The saloon seemed to grow quieter around them, the sounds of conversation and clinking glasses fading into the background. The bartender rubbed a hand over his face, glancing toward a shadowed table in the corner, where two men sat nursing their drinks. After a long pause, he lowered his voice. "Nathaniel was a good man, didn't have many enemies, least not the kind you'd expect to put a bullet in his back, but he was poking around where he shouldn't have been." Liza's heart stilled. "Where?" The bartender shook his head again, muttering something under his breath. "He was asking too many questions about the mines, about who was really running things in Sundown Gulch." Liza frowned. "Not just the mines." The bartender glanced toward the door, as if expecting someone to walk in at any moment. "Miss Caldwell, listen to me good. There's men in this town who don't take kindly to folks sticking their noses where they don't belong. You want to stay safe. Forget about Nathaniel. Let the past be the past." Liza's breath came faster, her mind racing. Nathaniel had been investigating something before he died. Something connected to the town's elite. Something someone had killed him for. The bartender must have seen the determination in her face, because he exhaled sharply and muttered, "Damn fool girl," before grabbing a glass and busying himself with drying it. Liza straightened, nodding her thanks, even as her thoughts spun. She turned toward the door, but before she could step away, the bartender spoke again. "If you're smart, miss, you'll be on the next wagon out of here." She hesitated, then lifted her chin. "I came here to build a life," she said, "and I intend to find out who took that from me." Then she walked out of the saloon, into the night, and into a mystery she was determined to solve. The house was silent, except for the soft rustling of fabric as Liza moved through the small bedroom, her fingers trailing absently along the edge of the wooden dresser. The air was thick with the scent of old wood, dust, and something faintly familiar. Nathaniel. She swallowed the lump in her throat, her chest tight as she took in the neatly folded shirts stacked in the open trunk at the foot of the bed, the boots placed carefully by the door, the pocket watch resting on the nightstand. All remnants of a life never lived. He had prepared for her arrival, made space for her in his home, and now he was gone. Her fingers trembled as she smoothed over the edge of the quilt covering the bed, the weight of loss pressing down on her. She hadn't even known him. Not really. The letters had been her only glimpse into the man she had been meant to marry. Yet, as she stood in the middle of what should have been their shared home, the grief was real, raw, heavy. A deep breath. Another. She could not fall apart. Instead, she forced herself to focus. Something wasn't right. Nathaniel had been killed before she even arrived, shot in the back like a man caught off guard, as though he had stepped into something far bigger than he had realized, and according to the bartender at the saloon, he had been asking too many questions. About the mines? About the town's elite? Liza's jaw tightened. She needed answers. She crossed the room and knelt beside the open trunk, pushing aside the neatly folded clothing. Beneath the crisp linen shirts and work trousers she found a small, leather-bound ledger, its edges worn from use. She frowned, pulling it free and flipping it open. The first few pages were filled with ordinary notations. Figures, supply lists, receipts for cattle purchases. But as she turned further, the entries became less clear, the handwriting more hurried, the ink smeared slightly beneath her fingertip as she traced the last legible words. Meeting didn't go as planned. They know I've been asking questions. Need to be careful if something happens. The rest of the sentence was torn away. Lisa's breath caught in her throat. A half-burned page, its edges curled and blackened, was stuffed between the last pages. She carefully pulled it free, her pulse quickening as she read the words still visible through the scorched paper. Land claims, gold mine, deception, cover-up. Gareth in the way. Her hands shook as she turned the page over, searching for more, anything that might explain what Nathaniel had discovered, but there was nothing. Just charred edges and the weight of a mystery too dangerous to leave alone. Someone had tried to destroy this. Someone had wanted Nathaniel silenced. Her fingers clenched around the fragile paper, anger sparking through the sorrow that had been weighing her down. He had died for this. He had known something, had gotten too close to something, and no one, not the sheriff, not the town elders, not even his own family, seemed willing to talk about it. She had to know why. She hadn't come all this way to be widowed before she had even been a wife. She hadn't left behind everything. Her past, her home, her only chance at security, just to accept that the man she had been promised had been cut down in the dark with no justice, no reckoning. She would not let them erase him. Liza took a steadying breath, carefully folding the burned paper and tucking it into the pocket of her skirt. Her grief was still there, sharp and aching, but beneath it something new had taken root. Resolve. She was done being a victim. Nathaniel had sought the truth, and now so would she. The wind kicked up a swirl of dust as Liza stepped out of the saloon, blinking against the late afternoon sun. She barely noticed the grit clinging to her skirts, barely felt the oppressive heat pressing against her skin. Her mind was a storm of questions, circling back to the burned ledger and Nathaniel's final, unfinished words. Someone had wanted him dead, someone had wanted to bury the truth. She needed help, but not the kind the sheriff was willing to give. She took a deep breath, scanning the bustling main street. Ranchers moved between storefronts, women in faded calico skirts carried baskets from the general store, and rough-looking men lingered beneath the saloon's awning, their gazes sharp and assessing. And then she saw him. He was standing apart from the others, leaning against the hitching post near a pair of restless horses, his arms crossed loosely over his broad chest, a man who didn't quite belong. His hat sat low over his brow, casting a shadow across his face, but she caught the sharp glint of his eyes beneath the brim. Cool, watchful, dangerous. His frame was tall and lean, the worn leather of his duster coated in trail dust, the handle of a revolver peeking out from beneath its folds. Something about him made the fine hairs on the back of her neck prickle. Liza wasn't naive. She had been around enough rough men in her lifetime to recognize the ones who carried violence with them like a second skin, but she needed answers, and if anyone in this town knew the truth about men who killed for power, it was him. Steeling herself, she stepped forward. The man didn't move, didn't shift his weight, didn't even acknowledge her approach until she stopped directly in front of him. Then, lazily, he tilted his head just enough to look at her, his eyes a piercing blue. Great. Like the sky before a storm. He took his time assessing her, his gaze flicking from the hem of her dress to the stubborn lift of her chin. Liza swallowed. She had the distinct impression she was being measured, weighed against something only he could see. "You got a reason for starring?" he drawled. His voice was low, rough like gravel, and laced with something unreadable, not quite hostility, but not kindness either. Liza squared her shoulders. "I need to ask you something." His mouth quirked at the edges, though it wasn't a smile. "Ain't much for conversation, sweetheart." "I'm not your sweetheart," she shot back. That earned her a slight raise of his brows. Someone nearby let out a bark of laughter, but she didn't look away from him. Couldn't. This man was dangerous. She knew it as sure as she knew her own name, but so was the truth. "Your name?" she said, her voice even. "What is it?" He studied her for a long moment, then sighed, pushing off the hitching post. "Colt Mercer." The name felt like a warning. "I hear you're a bounty hunter." His expression didn't change, but she caught the way his fingers flexed against his belt. "You hear a lot of things, do you?" She held her ground. "I hear you find men who don't want to be found." A muscle ticked in his jaw. "And," she exhaled slowly, forcing herself to be brave, "I need you to find a killer." That got his attention. His gaze sharpened, cutting straight through her, stripping her bare. She felt it down to her bones. The shift in the air, the way his posture changed, his stance, shifting just enough to suggest interest. Or danger. For a long time he said nothing. Then, after what felt like an eternity, he let out a slow breath and muttered, "Hell." Liza's heart pounded, because she knew, in that moment, she had just tangled herself with a man who would either help her or destroy her, and maybe both. Act 2. Into the wild. Liza stood her ground, watching as Colt Mercer exhaled sharply and rolled his shoulders, as though already regretting this conversation. A gust of wind carried dust through the street, lifting the ends of her skirts and ruffling the edges of his long, trail-worn duster. The weight of the moment settled between them, thick with unspoken words, challenges yet to be met. Colt shifted his stance, adjusting the worn leather of his gun belt. "You don't know what you're asking, lady." "I know exactly what I'm asking," Liza replied, her voice unwavering. "Nathaniel was murdered, and this town is pretending it didn't happen." His gaze flickered, something unreadable in the stormy depths of his blue-grey eyes. "And you think poking around is a good idea?" Liza crossed her arms, ignoring the way her heart pounded in her chest. "I think pretending it didn't happen is worse." A muscle ticked in his jaw. She had struck a nerve. Colt Mercer didn't seem like a man easily rattled, and yet there was something there just beneath the surface. A flicker of recognition, as if he'd walked this path before. "You should leave it alone," he muttered, casting a glance toward the saloon behind them, then sweeping his gaze over the street like a man who knew how quickly things could turn. His jaw tightened. "You're going to get yourself killed." Liza lifted her chin, ignoring the chill that rippled down her spine at his words. "Maybe, but I'm not going to sit back and do nothing while the man I was supposed to marry is buried and forgotten." Colt let out a slow breath, rubbing a hand over his jaw. His fingers curled into a loose fist before he dropped his arm to his side, his expression darkening. Liza could feel his frustration, his resistance, the war waging inside him, and then something shifted. It was in the way he squared his shoulders, the way his weight settled evenly between his feet, as if he had already made the decision but was still trying to convince himself otherwise. Finally he shook his head. "You're stubborn as hell." Liza's lips pressed together. "So I've been told." Colt exhaled sharply, then reached into his coat and pulled out a worn matchstick, rolling it between his fingers. His gaze pinned her in place, testing her resolve one last time. "What exactly do you think you're going to do?" Liza swallowed, steadying her voice. "Find the truth." His mouth twisted, something like amusement or disbelief flashing across his face. "And what happens when the truth don't want to be found?" She hesitated, but only for a second. "Then I'll find someone strong enough to help me dig it up." The words settled between them, unspoken challenge and reluctant respect tangling in the air. Colt studied her a long moment, then sighed and shoved the matchstick back in his coat. "You're not going to let this go, are you?" Liza shook her head. "Damn it!" He turned toward the street, muttering something under his breath. Then he glanced back, his gaze sharp. "Fine, I'll help you, but let's get one thing straight. You do exactly as I say, and if I tell you to walk away, you do it." Liza hesitated, then nodded. Colt let out another sigh, like a man already regretting his choices. "God help me!" A silent agreement. They started walking, side by side, though the distance between them was laced with tension and something unspoken. The town hummed around them, voices carrying from the storefronts, the distant clang of the blacksmith's hammer, the creak of a wagon passing by, but Liza was only aware of him. The way he walked, steady, alert, like a man who didn't trust the world enough to let his guard down. The way his eyes flickered to her every now and then, like he was still trying to figure her out. She glanced up, meeting his gaze just as he turned to look at her. Something passed between them then, a silent promise, a warning, a thread of understanding that neither of them fully grasped. They were in this now, and there was no turning back. The land stretched before them, vast, dry and unforgiving. Liza squinted against the glare of the noonday sun, her bonnet offering little relief from the relentless heat. The Badlands weren't like the rolling hills of home or the quiet, dusty streets of Sundown Gulch. This was untamed country, where jagged rock formations jutted from the earth like the bones of a long-dead beast, and the ground was cracked and thirsty beneath their horses' hooves. Wind swept through the canyon, kicking up dust and scattering it like whispers across the hard-packed earth. There were no trees to offer shade, no soft patches of grass to ease the journey. Just scrub brush, twisted mesquite, and the skeletal remains of cattle that hadn't survived the last drought. Liza's hands tightened around the reins of her borrowed horse, her muscles stiff from hours in the saddle. It had been a long time since she'd ridden, and her legs ached with each jostling step. Colt Mercer rode ahead, his posture easy, relaxed, as though the grueling heat and merciless terrain were nothing more than an inconvenience. His dark coat flapped against his saddle, and every so often he'd scan the horizon, his sharp gaze never resting too long in one place. He sensed danger. Liza felt it too, an uneasy stillness that clung to the land like a warning. "This place feels different," she murmured, shifting uncomfortably. Colt cast her a glance, but didn't slow his pace. "That's 'cause it is." She swallowed. "What do you mean?" He nodded toward the ridges that flanked them. "This is outlaw country." Her grip tightened on the reins. He must have sensed her unease because he continued, his voice even but firm. "Ain't saying someone's waiting to ambush us, but out here, if a man don't have a reason to be seen, he won't be." Liza glanced at the terrain warily, suddenly hyper-aware of every shadow, every place where a man could hide. They rode on, the silence between them growing heavier with each mile. The camp in the valley, it was nearly sundown when they reached the camp, a makeshift settlement of tattered tents, sagging wooden shacks and rusted wagons, all huddled together in a dry riverbed. Smoke curled from scattered campfires, and the smell of burned meat and unwashed bodies carried on the evening breeze. A few scrawny horses were tied to a corral post, their ribs showing beneath dull coats. The men who lingered in the shadows watching their approach looked just as worn. Colt's hand drifted to his revolver as they rode in. "Stay close," he murmured. Liza swallowed hard and nodded. As they reached the center of the camp, a grizzled man with yellowed teeth and a weathered face stepped forward, eyeing them suspiciously. "I didn't take you for the friendly type, Mercer," he said, spitting tobacco onto the ground. Colt swung down from his saddle with practiced ease, his boots kicking up dust as he landed. "I ain't here to be friendly." The man smirked, his gaze sliding to Liza. Something about the way he looked at her sent an ice-cold ripple down her spine. "New partner," he drawled. Colt's body tensed, but his voice remained level. "Ain't your concern." The man snorted, but seemed to think better of pushing further. He crossed his arms over his chest. "What do you want?" Colt glanced at Liza before turning back to the man. "Nathaniel Garrett." The shift was immediate, the camp grew quieter. A few men exchanged glances. A woman at a nearby fire lowered her tin cup. The man's jaw hardened. "Never heard of him." Colt sighed, the sound slow and deliberate. "See, I don't believe that." The man glared. "You calling me a liar?" Liza barely had time to react before Colt moved. So fast it startled her. In a single motion he grabbed the man's collar and yanked him forward, the ease of it terrifying in its control. "I'm saying I don't have patience for games," Colt said, his voice calm, deadly. "So let's try this again." The man swallowed, eyes darting. "Look, I don't know nothing, all right?" Colt didn't let go. Wrong answer. Liza's heart pounded. She knew Colt was dangerous, but watching him now she realized just how much. The man licked his lips, sweat beading on his forehead. All right, all right. He was sniffing around places he shouldn't have. Asked too many questions about the mines. Colt released him and he stumbled back, coughing. Liza forced her voice to remain steady. "And someone killed him for it?" The man hesitated. "Maybe, maybe not." Colt's hand flexed near his holster and the man flinched. "But if I was you," he continued, eyes flicking between them, "I'd stop asking." Liza stared at him, the weight of his warning sinking deep into her bones. They had stepped into something dangerous. And there was no turning back. The near bush. As they turned to leave, a flicker of movement caught Liza's eye, a shadow shifting just beyond the fire's glow, a figure, a flash of steel. "Colt!" she gasped. He spun just as a man lunged from the shadows, knife glinting in the dim light. Liza barely had time to move before Colt's gun was drawn, the barrel pressed against the attacker's chest. The man froze, chest heaving, his eyes wild. Colt's grip was steady, his expression unreadable. "You got exactly 3 seconds to rethink this." Silence stretched, thick and suffocating. Then, slowly, the man raised his hands and stepped back. "Smart choice," Colt muttered, lowering his gun. Without another word, he took Liza's arm and pulled her toward the horses. She didn't argue. Her hands trembled, her breath unsteady, but she didn't let herself break. Not here, not now. They rode out of the camp, the weight of what they had learned, what they had barely survived, settling between them. A wordless understanding. The sun had dipped below the horizon by the time they reached the ridge overlooking the valley. Colt pulled his horse to a stop, glancing back at her. "You all right?" Liza nodded, though she wasn't sure she was. They stared at each other in the growing twilight, something unspoken passing between them. Liza was beginning to understand that Colt Mercer was a man who lived in shadows, who had seen the worst the world had to offer, but he had protected her. And somehow she knew he would keep doing so. Neither of them spoke as they turned their horses towards Sundown Gulch, but they both knew this wasn't over, not by a long shot. The fire crackled softly, casting flickering light over the hard, packed ground, the glow stretching shadows across the rocky terrain. Overhead the sky had deepened to an endless black, jewelled with stars. The air, once heavy with the day's heat, had turned crisp, wrapping around Liza's shoulders like an unwelcome chill. She pulled her shawl tighter, watching the flames dance, the embers rising in lazy spirals toward the night. Across from her, Colt Mercer sat with his back against a boulder, one knee bent, a tin plate balanced in his hand. He wasn't eating much, just pushing the food around with his fork, his sharp gaze flickering to her every so often, as if trying to decide something about her. Liza ignored the way that look unsettled her. She was still shaken from the camp, still feeling the weight of the near ambush, the warning that had been issued with quiet, deadly finality. She should have been terrified, and maybe she was deep down, but more than fear, she felt determined. Nathaniel had died for something. She would not let it be in vain. Coulter took a bite of his food, then exhaled, setting his plate aside. "You holdin' up?" Liza blinked, surprised by the question. He hadn't spoken much since they'd ridden away from the outlaw camp, and she hadn't expected him to. He wasn't the kind of man who filled silence just to hear himself talk. She shifted, smoothing her skirt over her knees. "I'll be fine." One brow lifted, and in the firelight his expression looked almost amused. "Is right?" She bristled. "I'm not fragile." Colt studied her for a long moment, then huffed a quiet laugh. "No, you ain't." Liza wasn't sure why that small concession made her breath catch. Maybe because no one had ever said it before. Most men, her father, the folks back home, even Nathaniel's relatives, had looked at her like she was delicate, breakable, a woman who needed protecting. Colt Mercer looked at her like she was something else entirely. She cleared her throat, shifting uncomfortably. "What about you?" His lips twitched. "Me?" "Yes." She hesitated, then glanced at him. "That wasn't your first close call today, was it?" Colt's expression darkened, his features shifting into something harder, unreadable. He took his time answering, and when he did, his voice was quiet. "No, it wasn't." Liza waited, expecting him to say more, but he didn't. She frowned. "You always been a bounty hunter?" Colt tossed a small rock into the fire, watching as it sent a spray of embers skyward. "No." Another beat of silence. Liza sighed, setting her plate aside. "You're not much for conversation, are you?" He smirked, "Just a little." "I prefer actions over words." Liza shook her head, exasperated. "You must have a past, same as everyone else. I figure a man doesn't end up in your line of work without a story." Colt's smirk faded. His eyes flickered to the fire, his fingers tightening slightly around his tin cup. For a moment, Liza thought he wouldn't answer, but then his voice came, low and even. "Used to be a lawman." Liza's stomach dipped in surprise. "A sheriff?" Colt shook his head. "Deputy. Small town south of Abilene." He leaned forward, forearms resting on his knees. "Had a wife." Liza sucked in a breath, her heart skipping at the weight in his voice. Had. The single word carried years of loss and regret. Colt took a sip of his coffee, his jaw working before he continued. "We had a little ranch, nothing big, just enough land for some cattle, a few horses. Thought we'd grow old there." He exhaled, a long, slow breath. "Some men rode in. Thought they'd take what wasn't theirs. I stood against them." His gaze flickered to her, then back to the flames. "They made me pay for it." Liza's hands curled into the fabric of her skirt. "What happened?" she asked softly. Colt didn't look at her. "I lived. They didn't." The words hung between them, thick with unspoken meaning. Liza felt her throat tighten. She had lost someone too. But not like that, not in fire and gunsmoke, in the kind of blood-soaked violence that left a man changed forever. Her heart ached for him, but she didn't say so. Because Colt Mercer wasn't a man who wanted comfort. Instead, she did something she didn't entirely understand. She reached forward, picking up the coffee pot from the fire and pouring him another cup. Colt watched her, his expression unreadable. Liza met his gaze, steady, unwavering. "I'm sorry." For a long moment he said nothing. Then, slowly, he nodded. They sat there in the firelight, the night stretching long and quiet around them, the walls between them not quite gone, but not so high anymore. They weren't friends. Not yet. But something had shifted, and Lisa had the strangest feeling that, for the first time in a long while, Colt Mercer wasn't entirely alone. The fire had burned low, casting little more than a faint glow over the rocky clearing. The desert night was eerily still, the kind of silence that felt thick, pressing down on Lisa's skin. She shivered despite the warmth of the fire and pulled her shawl tighter round her shoulders. Colt sat across from her, his back resting against a boulder, his hat pulled low as though he was dozing. But Liza knew better. He was always listening, always watching. Even in the stillness, his fingers rested lightly against the butt of his revolver. She exhaled softly, turning her gaze downward, her hands fiddling with the worn leather strap of her satchel. The events of the day swirled in her mind. The near ambush, the outlaw's warning, the way Colt had moved like a shadow, dangerous and unflinching. But beneath it all was Nathaniel. What had he found? Her fingers tightened around the satchel's flap, her thoughts swirling with the same question that had haunted her since stepping off that wagon. She needed to know. Sucking in a steadying breath, she reached into her bag and pulled out the small, scorched ledger she had found in Nathaniel's belongings. The edges were crisp with burn marks, the ink smeared in places where fire had nearly consumed the words. Colt shifted, his gaze flicking toward her as she opened the book on her lap. "You still poking at that?" Lisa swallowed, tracing the rough edge of a torn page. "Something doesn't sit right with me." Colt made a low sound, something between a grunt and a sigh. "Ain't much left to read, far as I can tell." "Maybe not," she admitted, flipping carefully through the fragile pages. "But Nathaniel didn't just take notes for nothing. He was trying to piece something together." Colt didn't argue, just watched her with those unreadable eyes. Liza's gaze flickered over the faint scrawl of ink, the calculations and numbers, the dates that meant nothing to her. And then she froze. Her pulse skipped as she leaned closer, squinting in the dim firelight. There, pressed between the final pages, barely visible, was something small and metal. She plucked it free, holding it up between her fingers. A gold lapel pin, shaped like a coiled rattlesnake. She turned it over, her breath catching as she spotted an engraving on the back. S.S.C. Sundown Gulch Company. Her fingers trembled around the pin. Colt sat forward, frowning as he took it from her. He rolled it between his fingers, his expression darkening. "Where'd you find this?" "It was in Nathaniel's ledger," she murmured, still processing the weight of what she had uncovered. Colt swore under his breath. Damn fool was onto something after all. Liza's heart pounded. Nathaniel had kept this, hidden it, and now he was dead. She met Colt's gaze, her voice steadier than she felt. "This belongs to someone powerful, doesn't it?" Colt studied the pin for a long moment before slipping it into his coat pocket. His jaw was tight, his blue-grey eyes like steel. "Yeah," he said finally. "And if we dig deep enough, we're liable to find a snake at the other end." Liza swallowed, knowing full well that some snakes were deadly, but she had already lost too much to walk away now. She straightened, meeting Colt's gaze with quiet determination. "Then we dig." The fire crackled between them, sealing an unspoken agreement. They weren't just searching for the truth anymore, they were hunting it, and they wouldn't stop until they found it. The old homestead stood at the edge of Sundown Gulch, nestled against the backdrop of rolling, arid hills. The structure had once been grand, Lisa could tell. But time had not been kind to it. The roof sagged in places, the wooden shutters hung at odd angles, and weeds had claimed the dirt path leading to the front steps. Still, something about the house called to her. She pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders as she stood at the threshold, dust swirling in the late afternoon breeze. A sense of familiarity settled deep in her chest, a strange tug in her gut that she couldn't quite name. Beside her, Colt Mercer remained silent, his gaze sharp as he scanned their surroundings. He hadn't questioned her when she told him she needed to come here, hadn't pressed her for explanations, but she knew he was watching, waiting. She took a slow breath and pushed the heavy door open. It groaned under the weight of years, protesting her intrusion. Inside, the air was thick with a scent of aged paper, dried herbs, and dust. Sunlight filtered through the cracked shutters, casting golden shafts of light that illuminated the floating motes in the air. The furniture, though draped in sheets, bore the distinct craftsmanship of a different time. Hand-carved chairs, a sturdy oak desk, a rocking chair near the hearth, frozen mid-May Mass, as though someone had just risen from it. Liza exhaled, her fingers brushing over the back of a nearby chair. This house had belonged to someone once. Someone who had lived and breathed and dreamed beneath its roof. And she had a sinking suspicion that someone was connected to her. A legacy buried in ink. Her gaze landed on an old writing desk tucked in the corner of the parlour, its surface cluttered with stacks of brittle, yellowed paper. The sight of it sent a ripple of something through her. Recognition, maybe, or the first tendrils of understanding. She moved toward it, her fingers trailing across the dust-coated wood. With careful hands, she lifted the first few papers. Land deeds. Business agreements. Letters dated decades earlier, all signed in the same name. Caldwell. Liza's breath caught. She flipped through more pages, her heartbeat quickening. These weren't just any old documents. They were proof. Proof that the Caldwell family had once owned a significant portion of Sundown Gulch. She swallowed hard, her fingers tightening around the edges of the parchment. This town, this land, had been hers, or at least it should have been. The past speaks. A small, leather-bound book sat on the edge of the desk, its spine cracked with age. Liza reached for it, her hands trembling slightly as she opened to the first page. The ink had faded, but the words remained clear. September 4, 1845. The mine should have been ours. My father built it with his own hands, carved the tunnels himself. But power is not held by the man who toils. It is held by the man who wields the law in his favour. We were cast out, cheated, and forced to leave what was rightfully ours. I fear we will never reclaim it. Liza's breath came fast, uneven. She turned the page. November 2, 1845. They are watching us. They fear my father will take back what he built. But the law is not on our side. The sheriff is a friend of theirs, the judge the same. If we cannot win in court, we will win another way. There is a key, a deed, proof that my father never sold the land, never surrendered his claim. If something happens to us, I pray whoever finds this will not let them win. Her fingers trembled over the words. A key, a deed, proof. Nathaniel had been investigating something about the mines. But what if it wasn't just about recent corruption? What if he had stumbled upon something much older, something that had started with her own family? A question that changes everything. Colt had been standing quietly, but now he moved closer. His presence was solid, grounding. But his voice was unreadable. You're pale. Liza swallowed. This house belonged to my family? Colt's eyes narrowed slightly, his gaze flicking to the papers in her hands. That what those say? She nodded, her throat thick. They owned land here, a lot of it, and they lost it. Colt's jaw tensed. Stolen? She hesitated, then met his gaze. I think so. Colt's fingers brushed the edge of a nearby document, his brow furrowing. That what Nathaniel was onto? The thought made her stomach churn. Nathaniel had been searching for answers about the mine. But what if it wasn't just about shady dealings among the town's current elite? What if he'd discovered the theft of an entire legacy? Her legacy? A chill ran down her spine. Liza looked around the old house again, really seeing it this time. The weight of its history pressed against her, whispering of things long buried, long forgotten. Maybe Nathaniel had uncovered something. Maybe he had died for it. She turned back to Colt, her voice barely above a whisper. I need to find that deed." Colt's expression remained unreadable for a moment, his blue-grey eyes locked onto hers. Then, finally, he nodded. "We will." And just like that, their search changed. It was no longer just about justice. It was about a past stolen, a fortune hidden, and a truth someone had killed to keep buried. And Liza wasn't about to let them get away with it. The wind had picked up, rustling through the skeletal remains of trees on the edge of the property, carrying the scent of dry earth and coming rain. The old homestead loomed behind Liza, its battered shutters creaking in the breeze as though whispering the secrets it had kept for far too long. She stood on the porch, staring out into the vast, untamed land that had once belonged to her family. It should have been hers. Nathaniel had died trying to expose the truth about the mine, about the town, about what was stolen, and now she held the proof of it in her trembling hands. A faded ledger, a letter scrawled in ink that had long since browned with age, and the weight of an entire history that had been erased. The Caldwell family had built this town, and then they had been driven out, buried beneath the greed of men who had rewritten history in their own favor. Her heart pounded as she flipped through the fragile pages of the journal, her eyes catching words that burned their way into her soul. "They will never let us reclaim what is ours. The sheriff will not act. The judge is one of them. If justice does not come for them, they will take everything from us." Liza swallowed hard, her pulse roaring in her ears. Everything had been taken from them. The land, the mine, their name. And now Nathaniel. She felt the first stirrings of something fierce, something defiant push through the grief that had been anchoring her down for days. She had arrived in Sundown Gulch as a mail-order bride, a woman desperate for a new beginning, for stability, for the promise of a husband and a home. But she was so much more than that now. She was a Caldwell, and she would not let them steal what was rightfully hers. A conversation in the dark. Colt had been watching her. He sat on the edge of the porch, his long legs stretched out, one boot braced against the railing as he rolled a matchstick between his fingers. He hadn't said much as she'd unearthed the truth inside that house, hadn't pressed her when he saw the way her hands trembled, or the way her breath hitched as she put the pieces together. But now, as the last of the sun dipped below the horizon and left them in the glow of a lantern, he finally spoke. "You gonna tell me what's going on in that head of yours?" Liza exhaled, the weight of her discovery settling deep in her chest. She turned, meeting his gaze. The firelight flickered against his face, sharpening the angles of his jaw, casting shadows across the blue-grey eyes that always seemed to see too much. "I think my family was murdered," she said, the words slipping out in a whisper. Colt's expression didn't change, but she saw the way his jaw tightened. "Go on," he said. Liza sat beside him, the wooden porch cool beneath her palms. She placed the journal between them, tapping the open page with her fingertip. "This was written by my great-uncle. I didn't even know he existed until today." She hesitated, then continued. "He knew something was going to happen to them. They were driven off their land, and he knew the men responsible weren't going to stop there. He wrote this before they disappeared." Court took the book from her, scanning the faded words, his brow furrowed. "If this is true, we're talking about a cover-up that goes back decades." Liza nodded, the realization sending a shiver down her spine. Nathaniel was asking questions about the mine. But what if it wasn't just about illegal dealings now? What if he found proof that my family never sold it? Colt let out a slow breath, shutting the book with a quiet thud. Then someone's been sittin' on stolen land for a hell of a long time. Liza pressed her hands together, feeling the weight of it all. The injustice, the loss, the years of silence. Nathaniel found something. And they killed him for it? Colt studied her for a long moment, his gaze unreadable. Then, without a word, he took the rattlesnake lapel pin from his pocket and turned it over in his palm. The engraved SMC caught the light. "You think this ties back to them?" he asked. Liza inhaled sharply. I don't think I know. The Sundown Gulch Company, the most powerful men in town, the ones Nathaniel had been investigating. And now they were her enemies too. Colt exhaled through his nose, then glanced at her. You know what this means, don't you? Liza nodded, a fire settling deep in her belly. She knew exactly what it meant. They wouldn't stop at Nathaniel. They wouldn't stop at stealing land, or rewriting history, or threatening anyone who got too close to the truth. But she wasn't walking away. For the first time since stepping off that wagon, she knew exactly who she was. She was Liza Caldwell, and she was ready to take back what belonged to her. Colt watched her, something flickering behind his gaze, and then, in a low, quiet voice, he said, Then we take 'em down. The words settled between them, heavy and final. A promise, a reckoning, a war on the horizon. Liza didn't know what would come next, only that she would not run. Not this time. The windows were cracked, the wooden beams overhead groaning with age, and the scent of old hay and damp earth clung to the air. But tonight the space was alive. Men and women filled the room, ranchers whose land had been whittled away by greedy hands, shopkeepers who paid their dues in silence to avoid trouble, miners who worked themselves to the bone for wages that barely fed their families. These were the people of Sundown Gulch, forgotten, beaten down, but not broken. Liza stood near the center of the room, the flickering light from oil lanterns casting golden shadows across her face. She had never led anything before. She had never stood before a crowd and demanded they listen. But she wasn't the woman she had been when she arrived. She had walked through grief, unearthed secrets meant to stay buried, learned the truth of who she was. And now she was standing exactly where she was meant to be. A murmur rippled through the gathered townsfolk, voices hushed but filled with unease. They were afraid, and they had every reason to be. She swallowed the fear rising in her own throat and took a step forward. We all know why we're here. The murmurs faded, eyes turned toward her, expectant, wary. She steadied her voice, her hands tightening at her sides. We have lived under their rule for too long. The men who run this town, the men who steal, who take what isn't theirs, who kill without fear of consequence, they have controlled what isn't theirs, who kill without consequence. They have controlled without fear of consequence. A man in the crowd, a grizzled ranger with lines etched deep into his sun-darkened skin, spoke up. And what can we do about it? Speak too loud and a man ends up missing. A quiet murmur of agreement swept through the crowd. Liza lifted her chin. That's what they want you to believe. Her voice rose strong and clear. They want you afraid. They want you silent. But tell me this, how much more are we willing to lose? The room stilled. They stole my family's land, she continued, her voice trembling with rage, with defiance. They buried the truth, killed the people who got too close to it, and still, they sit in their grand houses, drinking their expensive whiskey, knowing we won't fight back. A woman near the back, clad in a simple patched dress, a child clinging to her skirts, spoke, her voice hesitant. Miss Caldwell, we got families. We got mouths to feed. What if we fail? Liza's throat tightened. These were good people, hard-working, loyal, resilient, but worn thin from a lifetime of battle. Colt, who had been leaning against a post near the doorway, silent and watchful, finally spoke. She's right. Heads turned toward him. He pushed off the wall, his voice low and edged with steel. A fight's coming whether you want it or not. You can either take your licking leaning or you can stand up and throw a punch. Liza saw the way his words settled into their bones. A young man, a miner with soot-stained hands, barely more than 20, crossed his arms. And if we do stand, what then? Liza let the question hang in the air. Then she stepped forward, letting her conviction burn through every syllable. Then we take back what's ours. A murmur rippled again, but this time it wasn't doubt. It was something else, something more dangerous. Hope. Lisa's heart pounded. She knew the risks. She knew what they were up against. But if no one fought back, nothing would ever change. "I won't lie to you," she continued. "This won't be easy. They'll come after us. They'll try to scare us back into silence. But if we stand together, if we stop letting them decide who lives and who dies, who wins and who loses, then they lose their power over us." Colt moved to her side, his voice quiet but firm. "And if you're ready to fight, you won't be alone." The room pulsed with tension. Lisa held her breath, waiting, watching. Then the grizzled rancher who had spoken earlier gave a slow nod. "I'm in." A younger woman, one of the seamstresses from town, her eyes bright with fire, stepped forward. "Me too!" One by one, hands lifted, voices murmuring agreement. They weren't warriors. They weren't trained fighters, but they were people who had been wronged. And they were done bowing. Liza's chest tightened as she looked out over the crowd. This was it, the first step toward justice, toward war. She lifted her chin, feeling the weight of her family's past, of Nathaniel's death, of all the lives that had been lost and forgotten. No more. She met Colt's gaze, her heart hammering as she whispered the words that sealed everything. "We start tonight." And with those 3 words, the battle for Sundown Gulch began. The town of Sundown Gulch was changing. It didn't happen in one grand moment of defiance, but in small, deliberate acts of rebellion, woven together like strands of a rope, growing stronger with each passing day. By daylight, the town carried on as it always had. Shopkeepers tending to their stores, ranchers driving their cattle, women bustling between the mercantile and the bakery. But in the shadows, something was stirring. They were preparing. A town awakens. The blacksmith's forge burned late into the night, hammer striking metal in a rhythm that felt like a war drum. What had once been tools and horseshoes were now knives, rifle parts, and crude but effective weapons. At the boarding house, rooms once meant for weary travellers became meeting places, where men and women gathered in hushed voices to plot their next move. The seamstresses who spent their days mending dresses were now sewing hidden pockets into coats and skirts, places to stash stolen ledgers, secret messages, and ammunition. Even the children were given a role, running messages between outlying farms, their small feet unnoticed by the watchful eyes of the town's corrupt elite. It was happening, and it was happening right under their oppressors' noses. Forging alliances in the back room of the general store, Liza and Colt sat at a wooden table, studying stolen maps of the mine, tracing their fingers over old property lines, matching them with the hidden ledger entries. "We hit the supply chain first," Colt murmured, tapping his finger on a point near the mine's western entrance. "Cut them off at the knees before they know what's coming," Liza nodded. "If we move too soon, they'll shut everything down before we have proof. We need a witness. Someone from the inside." Colt leaned back in his chair, studying her. "You got someone in mind?" Liza's pulse quickened. She did. A mine foreman, a man who had looked at her with too much guilt when she'd asked about Nathaniel in passing. She glanced at Colt, saw the way he was watching her, not with doubt, but with something steadier, something solid. And that was when she realized he trusted her judgment. "We'll get to him first," she said, setting her jaw. "Before they do." Colt gave a slow nod. "Then we best not waste time." Hours later, long after the last of the meetings had ended, Liza found herself standing near the edge of town, the cool night air brushing against her skin. Colt was beside her, arms crossed, his hat pulled low against the wind. For the first time since they had started down this path, neither of them spoke. The silence wasn't uncomfortable. If anything, it felt like a rare breath in the storm. A pause before the next battle, a moment where they weren't strategizing or planning or fighting for something bigger than themselves. Liza turned to him, her voice quiet. "You ever wonder what life would have been like if none of this had happened?" Colt was still for a moment, then let out a slow exhale. "Can't say I do." She frowned. "Why not?" He glanced at her, his blue-grey eyes holding a weight she hadn't expected. "Because wonder won't change it." Liza swallowed. "No, but it doesn't mean we can't want something more." Colt studied her then, the air between them thick with something undeniable, something that had been growing between them from the very start. "You think you'll want more when this is done?" he asked, his voice quieter now. Liza's breath hitched. Before, she would have said no. Before, she had been a woman with nothing but a promise of a man she had never met. Now she was something else. Stronger, fierce, alive. And standing next to a man who had become something more than an ally, she held his gaze, her heart pounding. "I don't know what I'll want." Colt took a slow step toward her, not touching her, not crowding her, but close enough that she felt his presence like a brand. "But I think I'll want to find out." The words hung between them, not quite a promise, not quite a confession, just truth. Liza inhaled sharply, feeling the moment shift, feeling everything shift. They weren't just fighting for justice. They were fighting for something else, too, something neither of them dared name. Not yet. She turned back toward the town, the warmth of his nearness lingering even as he stepped back. Tomorrow they would fight. Tonight they were just two people standing beneath the stars, on the precipice of something neither of them had expected, and for now, that was enough. The meeting hall was thick with anticipation, the air charged with the restless energy of people on the edge of revolution. Liza stood near the front, her hands gripping the worn wood of the table as she scanned the faces before her. Ranchers, merchants, miners, wives clutching their shawls as they whispered to one another. These were her people now. Tonight was the night they would finalize their strike, the night they would turn their whispered defiance into action. Across the room, Colt stood near the doorway, his arms crossed, his stance as solid as ever. A sentry always watching. Liza took a deep breath and raised her voice. "By morning, we take back what was stolen from us." A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. She turned to Hank Greeley, the foreman from the mines, the man who had been one of their first allies, one of the first to risk himself for the cause. "Hank, is everything set at the mine?" she asked, relief washing through her at the sight of his familiar, reassuring face. He nodded, his grizzled features tense but determined. "We'll cut off their supply routes before sunrise." Liza exhaled, grateful. "Good. Then—" The shot rang out before she could finish, a single, sharp crack of gunfire that shattered the moment like glass. The room erupted into chaos. Colt was already moving, his gun drawn, shoving Liza behind him as chairs toppled and people scrambled. Liza's breath came fast and sharp as she turned toward the source of the shot, toward Hank. He hadn't been hit, he was holding the gun, pointed right at them. The room went deadly silent. Liza's stomach dropped into a bottomless pit. Hank? His face, which had once held kindness and loyalty, was cold, now unreadable. "I tried warning you," he said, his voice tight. "Told you not to stir up trouble." Liza shook her head, the betrayal cutting deep, sharp as a blade. You were with them all along?" Hank exhaled, his shoulders tensing. "Ain't as simple as that. You don't understand who you're dealing with. The men in charge of this town, they don't leave loose ends." Liza felt sick. He had sat at their table, listened to their plans, earned their trust, and now he was handing them over to the men who had killed Nathaniel. Colt's voice was low and lethal. "You just made a real bad mistake." Hank cocked the hammer back. "I ain't the only one," he said. Then the doors burst open. Men poured in, armed, ruthless, their coats marked with the insignia of the Sundown Gulch Company. A trap. It had been a trap all along. Gunfire exploded through the room. Screams, shouts, the acrid scent of gunpowder filling the air. Colt grabbed Liza, pulling her down just as a bullet splintered the table beside them. "Stay low," he barked, returning fire. Lisa's pulse roared in her ears, her hands trembling as she crawled behind an overturned bench. People were running, some fighting, some falling, and through it all, Hank stood there, watching. Lisa's vision blurred, rage and betrayal mixing with the thick haze of smoke. "You sold us out!" she whispered. He met her gaze, something almost like regret flickering there. "I kept myself alive." Lisa's hands clenched into fists. Everything they had worked for, all the sacrifices, all the risks, had just collapsed in an instant. She couldn't breathe. The world tilted, the gunfire growing muffled, distant. Her pulse pounded against her temples, the weight of betrayal crashing over her like a wave. She had fought so hard, and now it was all slipping away. A pair of hands grabbed her shoulders. "Liza!" Colt's voice. Urgent, rough, real. She blinked up at him, barely aware that she had fallen to her knees. The chaos blurred, a swirl of dust and firelight, of screams and running footsteps. Colt yanked her to her feet, his grip solid, grounding. "We have to move!" Lisa gasped, her vision tunneling. "But—" Colt shook his head. "Not now. We live to fight another day." His words struck something deep inside her, something primal and aching. She had lost battles before, but this war wasn't over, not yet. She nodded, her legs unsteady but her resolve solid as iron. Colt wrapped an arm around her, guiding her through the smoke, through the shattered remains of what had once been their rebellion. And as they disappeared into the night, Lisa swore she would make them pay. The wind howled through the canyon, whipping against the jagged cliffs and sending dust spiraling through the cracks of the abandoned mining shack where Lisa sat curled in the corner. She barely felt the cold, barely registered the aching throb in her legs from the long, desperate ride that had brought her here. Her breath shuddered in the darkness, her arms wrapped around her knees as she stared at the flickering lantern that cast shadows against the warped wooden walls. This wasn't how it was supposed to end. She had fought, bled for this town, for these people, for a future that wasn't ruled by fear and greed, and yet in the span of mere minutes it had all crumbled. Hank. His face burned behind her eyelids, the betrayal still fresh, still raw. She had trusted him, had believed in him, had believed that if she could just fight hard enough, lead well enough, she could change things. But she had been wrong, so painfully, foolishly wrong. She had led them straight into a trap. People had died tonight because of her. Her breath hitched, her fingers pressing hard against her temples as she tried to silence the memories already clawing their way back. Flash. Gunfire tearing through the meeting hall, the acrid scent of burning wood, the way the air had split apart with screams. Flash. Colt grabbing her, his grip so solid, so unyielding, forcing her to move, forcing her to live when everything inside her had wanted to collapse. Fashionable? The look in Hank's eyes when he turned on her. Not hate, not even regret, just inevitability. She squeezed her eyes shut, willing the pain away, willing the crushing weight of failure to stop pressing so damn hard against her chest. She had thought she could be a leader, but all she had done was get people killed. The lantern flickered, the wind rattling the loose boards in the walls. The distant howl of a coyote sent a shiver down her spine, but she didn't move, didn't dare move, because if she let herself feel everything at once, she wasn't sure she'd ever get up again. A faint noise outside. Lisa stiffened. She reached for the knife strapped to her boot, her heart hammering as she pressed herself against the wall, her ears straining in the silence. The door creaked. A shadow loomed in the doorway, tall, broad, and then Colt staggered inside. Liza's breath ripped from her chest. His coat was torn, his shirt damp with blood near his ribs, his normally sharp gaze clouded with exhaustion. He swayed for a fraction of a second before gripping the door frame, his knuckles white. Relief and panic warred inside her. "Colt, had a hell of a time find you," he rasped, his voice rough with fatigue. Lisa sprang forward, reaching for him, just as he lost his balance. She caught him as best she could, his weight knocking her backward slightly, his warmth solid against her despite the chill in the air. For a moment neither of them spoke. His breaths were ragged, his pulse thundering beneath her fingertips. Then, in a voice so quiet it nearly broke her, he muttered, "You can't give up now, Liza." Something inside her cracked. She clenched her jaw, blinking against the stinging heat behind her eyes. "Colt, But she didn't know how to finish the sentence. She didn't know how to explain the unbearable weight of everything that had happened, didn't know how to admit that she didn't know how to fix this. Colt must have seen it in her face, because he exhaled slowly, his good hand lifting to cup the side of her face. It was the first time he had touched her like this, not out of necessity, not out of survival, but just to hold her. His thumb brushed against her cheek, and despite everything, her breath hitched. "You hear me?" he murmured, his voice raw, quiet. "They took tonight from us, but they ain't taking everything." Liza swallowed hard, searching his face. "How do you know?" Coulter half murked, despite the pain in his eyes. "'Cause I'm still breathing. And so are you." A tear slipped free before she could stop it, and for the first time since the gunfire had erupted in that meeting hall, she believed him. Because if Colt Mercer, a man who had seen more bloodshed, more loss than most men could survive, could still stand, still fight, then so could she. She pressed her forehead against his for just a moment, just long enough to let the grief settle, just long enough to let his strength ground her. And then, taking a steadying breath, she whispered, "Then we rise." Colt's lips curved just slightly. "Damn right we do." And with those words, the war for Sundown Gulch truly began. The abandoned barn stood on the outskirts of Sundown Gulch, hidden in a grove of cottonwood trees, its wooden beams weathered by time and dust. It smelled of old hay, damp earth, and the lingering scent of horses long gone. Inside, a single lantern cast a golden glow, flickering shadows across the rough-hewn walls. The night wind slipped through the cracks in the wood, carrying whispers of a world that had burned around them. Liza sat on an overturned crate, hands trembling as she dipped a cloth into a basin of water, the liquid darkened with blood. Colt's blood. He was slouched against the stool wall, his duster peeled away, his shirt torn and stained red. The wound in his side wasn't deep, but it was enough to slow him down. He watched her, his expression unreadable, his lips pressed into a thin line as she reached for him. "Let me see," she murmured. He hesitated, just long enough for her to know he hated needing help, but then, without a word, he shifted slightly, giving her access. Liza swallowed, pressing the cloth to his side. Colt let out a low hiss, his fingers tightening into a fist. She winced. "Sorry," he exhaled through his nose. "I've had worse." Liza bit her lip, focusing on the task at hand, but her hands weren't steady, not because of the blood or the sight of torn flesh, but because everything was different now. The betrayal, the loss, the gut-wrenching knowledge that they had been outplayed, that she had been outplayed. Cope must have sensed it, because after a long moment of silence he said, "Ain't your fault, Liza." Her throat tightened. "It was my plan." "You think that means you should have seen it coming?" His voice was low, rough around the edges. "That's not how this works." She pressed her lips together, wringing out the cloth. "I thought I was smart enough, careful enough." "You were," he said, his tone steady. "Hank fooled everyone, not just you." Liza shook her head, the weight of it all pressing down on her. "People died because I trusted him." Colt was quiet for a beat. Then he reached out, not fast, not sudden, just a slow, deliberate movement that ended with his fingers curling around hers. The touch was warm, solid. She glanced up, startled. His gaze held hers, steady, grounding. "You lost a battle," he said quietly. "Not the war." A lump rose in her throat. Colt squeezed her fingers just once, just enough to remind her that she wasn't alone. Then he let go, nodding toward the wound she hadn't finished dressing. a man who had been willing to die at her side, a man who had found her in the dark when she had been ready to give up. She pressed the last bandage in place, tying it off as gently as she could. "There," Colt smirked, the corner of his mouth quirking. "Not bad." "Not bad?" she huffed. "I should let you bleed." He chuckled, low and rough. "Wouldn't be the first time." She shook her head, exasperated, but somehow the tension had eased. The darkness that had threatened to drown her had lifted, if only a little. Liza leaned back, studying him. The flickering lantern light softened the hard angles of his face, made him look less like a gunslinger and more like a man who had once known a life before all this. "Colt." He met her gaze, his expression unreadable again. She swallowed, her heart pounding. "Why are you still here?" He didn't blink. "Because you are." The words landed deep in her chest, knocking the breath from her lungs. She hadn't expected that, hadn't expected him to answer so simply, so completely. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Colt sighed, running a hand over his jaw. "You really want to know why?" Liza nodded, barely trusting her voice. He leaned forward slightly, resting his forearms on his knees. "'Cause I've seen a lot of things in my life. Bad things. Things that make a man believe there's nothing good left in this world." Her throat tightened. He held her gaze, didn't look away. "And then," he said, voice quieter now, "I met you." The air between them shifted, heavy with something unspoken, something neither of them were quite ready to name. Lisa's chest ached with it. She swallowed. "I'm not—" "Don't." His voice was soft but firm. She shut her mouth. Colt studied her, then leaned back against the stall wall, exhaling slowly. "You're still breath in, Liza Caldwell. That means we're not done yet." Liza looked at him, at the man who had stood beside her when everything else had crumbled. And for the first time since the betrayal, since the bloodshed, since everything fell apart, she believed him. She wasn't done, not yet. She straightened, the fire in her belly burning again, hotter, stronger. They had lost the battle. But the war was just beginning, and this time they wouldn't lose. The room was dim, lit only by the flickering glow of lanterns and the steady burn of determination. Liza stood at the center of the makeshift war room, an old stable that smelled of hay, damp wood and sweat. Around her, her allies gathered, tough, weary men and women who had once been broken, but were now sharpening themselves into something dangerous. On the table before them, a tattered map of Sundown Gulch lay unfurled, weighted at the corners by old tin cups and revolver cartridges. Colt leaned over it, his fingers tracing the faded ink of the mining routes, his jaw set in that unreadable way of his. "We cut them off here." He tapped the western supply route, where the mine's shipments were moved under heavy guard. "They won't be expecting it. They think we're broken." A slow, dark smile curved the lips of Jed Tucker, one of the miners who had been whipped for speaking out against the Sundown Gulch Company. His knuckles were still raw from the punishment. He hadn't forgotten. "Well, they're in for a hell of a surprise," Jed muttered. A murmur of agreement rippled through the group. Liza took a deep breath, pressing her hands flat against the table. This was it, their counterstrike. She turned to Rosie Hale, the seamstress who had been sewing hidden pockets into their coats for smuggling weapons. "The women?" Rosie nodded, her brown eyes flashing. "Ready. Some of them have been training with the rifles their husbands think they don't know how to use." That brought a few quiet chuckles. But beneath the laughter there was steel. These were people who had bled, who had suffered, who had lost everything. And now they were done being afraid. Liza met each gaze in turn, the fire inside her burning steady. "This town was built by honest men and women," she said, her voice even but strong. "It was stolen, piece by piece, family by family. My people, my own kin, were forced into the dirt while men like Crawford Ramsay built their fortune off our backs." Silence settled, thick and charged. Liza swallowed hard. "I won't let them do it again." The weight of her words hung in the air. Then Colt spoke, his voice low but unshakable. "Then we take it back." His gaze met hers, steady, certain, and in that moment she knew. He believed in her. Not because she was the rightful heir to Sundown Gulch, not because of her family name, but because she had fought for it, because she had become something more than a mail-order bride or a woman running from her past. She had become a leader, a warrior, and this was her army. The planning continued deep into the night. The blacksmith worked tirelessly, hammering crude weapons into something lethal. The miners reinforced the wagons, turning them into barricades for when the streets of Sundown Gulch became their battlefield. The women sewed messages into their clothing, slipping coded notes between scraps of fabric. And through it all, Colt stayed by her side. Occasionally his hand would brush against hers as they studied the map. Occasionally she would catch him watching her, as if memorizing this moment, as if memorizing her. But neither of them said anything, because words weren't needed. By the time the first light of dawn stretched across the Badlands, Liza stood on the ridge overlooking the valley, Colt beside her. The sky was painted in hues of soft gold and dusky pink, the colors of a world reborn. Liza inhaled deeply, feeling the weight of everything that had come before and everything that was still ahead. She was not the same woman who had arrived in Sundown Gulch all those weeks ago. She had been broken, but she had rebuilt herself from the wreckage, and now she would reclaim what was hers. Colt watched her, his hat tipped low against the rising sun. "What happens if we win?" he asked, his voice rough but quiet. Liza looked at him, feeling the heat of something deeper than war, something more dangerous than any enemy they faced. "Did we find out what comes next?" Colt nodded. And as the sun rose over the Badlands, they turned back toward Sundown Gulch, toward war, toward victory, toward whatever waited on the other side. Together. The night was thick with the scent of gunpowder, sweat and dust as Liza, Colt, and their allies moved like shadows through the alleyways of Sundown Gulch. The town was quieter than usual, too quiet. The kind of stillness that came before a storm. Liza's pulse thundered in her ears as she pressed her back against the rough wooden planks of the mercantile's outer wall. Colt crouched beside her. His revolver was drawn, the lamplight catching on the worn metal. From across the street, Jed Tucker signaled. A quick flick of his fingers. "All clear!" Liza exhaled, steadying her nerves. Colt caught her eye, murmuring low, "Ain't too late to turn back." Liza glared. "Not on your life." A ghost of a smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "Didn't think so." She pulled in a slow breath, feeling the weight of everything that had led them here. Nathaniel's death, Hank's betrayal, the lives stolen, the land stripped from its rightful owners. Tonight it all ended. Colt nudged her, jerking his chin toward the main road. "Move!" She did, silent, controlled. Her allies moved as one, a force in the dark closing in on the men who had ruled this town with an iron grip for too long. Ahead, 2 sentries stood near the livery stable, their rifles slung over their shoulders. Liza's breath caught. If they were caught now, everything would be over before it started. Rosie eased up beside her, a smirk in place. "Let me handle this." Before Liza could object, Rosie strolled straight toward them, her shawl slipping off one shoulder, her hips swaying just enough to draw attention. "Even in boys?" she purred, her voice all honey and mischief. The sentries blinked, caught off guard. "Miss Rosie?" Liza nearly laughed. They were so distracted by Rosie's presence that they never saw the 2 men creeping up behind them. In one swift movement, Jed and another ally struck, knocking the guards out cold before they could sound the alarm. Rosie stepped over them with a huff. "Men are too easy," Colt snorted. "Remind me never to underestimate you, Rosie." she winked. "Smart man!" Liza shook her head but couldn't suppress the rush of exhilaration. One obstacle down, they slipped past the stable, inching toward the sheriff's office, the heart of their enemy's stronghold. The street before them stretched wide and empty, lit only by the faint glow of lanterns. Colt stiffened beside her. "We ain't alone." Liza followed his gaze and froze. Standing in the middle of the street, waiting for them, was Hank Greeley. Her stomach twisted, rage curling hot and sharp inside her. Hank smiled, that same snake-like grin from the night he betrayed them. "Knew you'd come," he drawled. "Ain't a single thing you can do that'll change the way this town works, girl." Liza stepped forward, ignoring the way her hands trembled. She had trusted this man, had believed he was one of them, and he had sold them all out. "You're wrong," she said, her voice steady despite the fire in her chest. "Your time is up." Hank chuckled, shifting his stance. "You think a handful of miners and ranchers are going to take down men like Ramsey? He owns this town." "Not anymore," Colt said, his gun never wavering. Hank's grin faltered, and then he went for his gun. Liza barely had time to react before Colt fired. A single shot rang out, echoing off the buildings. Hank staggered, clutching his shoulder, his gun clattering to the ground. He stared at them, his face pale, his mouth opening and closing as if to argue. Then he crumpled to the dirt. Liza exhaled shakily. Colt holstered his gun. "That's one snake down." She nodded, her pulse still hammering. But this wasn't over. Ahead, beyond the sheriff's office, the real fight awaited. Liza lifted her chin. It was time to finish this. Together they stepped into the darkness, toward the final battle for Sundown Gulch. The town square was a battlefield. Gunfire cracked through the air, echoing off wooden storefronts and rattling the ground beneath Liza's boots. Smoke curled between the buildings, a thick haze of dust and gunpowder that stung her throat. Screams and shouts tangled together, the chaos of the fight swallowing everything but instinct. Colt moved beside her, his revolver kicking back with each shot. Sharp, precise, every bullet counted. He was a man forged for moments like this, his body fluid and controlled, deadly and unwavering. Liza was not a soldier, but she was not the woman who had first stepped into this town, either. She lifted her rifle, steadying her aim just as one of Ramsey's men took cover behind a supply wagon. A breath, a shot. The man slumped forward, his gun clattering uselessly to the dirt. She didn't flinch. She couldn't. The battle surged around them. Miners, ranchers, merchants who had once cowered under the rule of the Sundown Gulch Company were now fighting for their town. Rosie knocked a man unconscious with the butt of a shotgun before darting into the cover of the general store, loading more ammunition into her weapon. Jed and a group of miners had taken the rooftops, raining fire down on the corrupt sheriff's deputies who had been paid to keep men like Ramsey in power. The fight was brutal. Men fell, buildings took bullets. The very ground of Sundown Gulch ran red with sacrifice. Liza had known they would pay a price for this fight, but as she ducked behind an overturned cart, panting, reloading her rifle with shaking fingers, she forced herself to remember. This was justice. This was for Nathaniel, for her family, for everyone who had been buried beneath the greed of powerful men. A figure moved through the smoke ahead of her, striding forward with confidence, untouched by the battle raging around him. Liza's breath caught in her throat. Crawford Ramsey, the man who had ordered Nathaniel's death, the man who had stolen her family's land, the man who had tried to destroy her. Liza rose slowly, her rifle aimed at him. Ramsey smiled, like a man who had already won. My, he drawled, his voice smooth despite the carnage around him. You do have fire in you, after all. She gritted her teeth. You killed Nathaniel. Ramsey didn't deny it. He lifted his hands. The expensive fabric of his coat barely rumpled, as if the fight was an inconvenience, not a war for the town's very soul. Nathaniel was a fool, he said, digging into things best left buried. Liza's pulse pounded, her fingers trembled around the trigger. He took a slow step forward, his voice dropping into something almost gentle. And you, my dear, are just like him." Liza swallowed hard. "What do you mean?" Ramsay sighed, as if she had disappointed him. "You really don't know, do you?" He glanced at the fighting behind them, unconcerned, then back at her. "Your grandfather was weak. He let himself believe in fairness, in rules. He should have known men like me, like my father, to leave things to chance." Liza's blood ran cold. Her family had been driven out of Sundown Gulch, forced to leave behind the mine, the land, everything, and now Ramsay was confirming what she had always suspected. He had known. His family had orchestrated it. Nathaniel was on the verge of proving it, she whispered. Ramsay inclined his head, and so we put him in the ground. Liza's stomach turned. She should have fired. She should have ended this right here, right now. But Ramsay was good at this. Manipulation. Power. He had spent his life making people bend, kneel, and she would be damned if she let him think she was weak. She steadied her grip, her voice steel. "Your time is up." Ramsay's smile curled with something dark. "Then do it." Liza didn't hesitate. The shot cracked the air, slicing through the noise of the fight. Ramsay's body jerked back, his hand pressing to his side, staggering but not falling. A second shot rang out. Colt's. This time Ramsay collapsed, the blood blooming beneath his fine coat. Liza stood over him, her breath sharp, her hands steady. For the first time, Crawford Ramsay looked afraid. She knelt beside him, her voice calm, final. "This town doesn't belong to you anymore." Ramsay's mouth twisted in pain, or was it fury? But he had no words left. He knew it was over. And as the fight raged on around them, the empire he had built crumbled into dust. It was over. The corrupt lawmen had fallen. Ramsay's hired guns had either fled or surrendered. Sundown Gulch was theirs again, but at a cost. Liza stumbled through the square, her pulse roaring in her ears as she took in the bodies of those they had lost. Jed Tucker shot through the chest while protecting the miners. Rosie's brother killed in the first wave of the fight. Victory was theirs, but it had been bought with blood. She turned, finding Colt in the midst of the wreckage, his coat streaked with dust and blood, but standing. Their eyes met. Their eyes met. Something wordless passed between them. Exhaustion, relief, grief, but beneath it all there was something else, the promise of something new. Liza swallowed hard, stepping toward him. Colt caught her before she could fall, before the weight of everything could finally break her. She leaned into him, just for a moment, just long enough to let herself feel the victory, the loss, the sheer enormity of what they had done. His voice was rough, low. "It's over." She lifted her head, staring at the town that had once been stolen from her family, the town she had just won back. And then, through the blood, through the loss, through the rising sun that cast golden light over the broken square, Liza Caldwell smiled. It was just the beginning. The streets of Sundown Gulch were unrecognizable in the soft morning light. The once blood-stained town square, where bodies had fallen and freedom had been fought for, now stood quiet, peaceful, a town awakening to a future it had never dared to dream. Liza walked slowly through the heart of her reclaimed home, her boots kicking up dust, in a place that had nearly swallowed her whole. Days had passed since the battle, since Ramsay had fallen, since his men had fled. The people of Sundown Gulch had wasted no time. The burned-out storefronts were already being repaired, boards nailed into place with new hands, stronger hands. The hands of people who no longer feared the men who once ruled over them. A child's laughter rang through the square. A woman swept her porch, her movements light as if the weight had finally lifted from her shoulders. Liza exhaled slowly, letting the sight fill her, letting herself breathe in this victory. She had dreamed of this, but never like this. She had come here as a mail-order bride, a woman desperate for a future, for security, for something more than an empty life. Now she was something else entirely. She had been broken, beaten, tested. She had bled, she had fought, she had lost. And in the end, she had risen. She touched the bandage at her shoulder, where a bullet had grazed her during the battle. A scar she would carry forever, just like all the others. Her family's past, Nathaniel's death, the loss of the innocent, it all lived inside her now. But so did the strength of those who had stood with her. And for the first time in her life, she knew exactly who she was. At the center of the town square, where once there had been fear, now stood something new. A wooden cross, hastily built but strong, marked the names of those who had fallen. Jed Tucker, Rosie's brother Daniel Hale, others who had fought for their freedom and paid the highest price. Lisa reached out, her fingertips brushing over the carved letters. They would never be forgotten. Lisa's chest tightened. She had fought this war beside him, had leaned on him when she thought she had nothing left, had seen him stand when others would have fallen. Now, as he walked toward her, there was no battlefield between them, only the open road ahead. Colt stopped beside her, looking at the cross. "They'd be proud of you," he said quietly. Lisa swallowed. "I hope so." His gaze shifted to her, steady, unwavering. "I know so." She took a slow breath. "And you?" His brow furrowed. "What about me?" Liza turned toward him fully. "What happens now, Colt?" For once he didn't have a quick answer. He rubbed a hand over his jaw, exhaling slowly, deliberately. "I came here to do a job," he admitted, "to bring in the men who needed bringing in. After that," he hesitated, shaking his head. "Didn't plan much beyond that." Liza nodded, trying to ignore the ache in her chest. He was a man of the road, a bounty hunter, a drifter. And she had just found her place. Maybe this was the end of their road. Colt watched her for a long moment. Then slowly he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small silver ring. Liza's breath caught. It was simple, unpolished, a piece of metal, nothing more, but it felt like everything. Colt turned it over in his fingers, then looked at her. "I don't reckon I'm much good at saying things," Lisa swallowed. "Then don't say them." His lips curved. "Just a little." Then, with a kind of steady certainty that sent warmth curling deep in her chest, he took her hand, slipping the ring onto her finger. It wasn't a proposal, not in the traditional sense, but it was a promise. That he wasn't leaving, that they weren't finished, that this new life they had built, this battle-won home, would be theirs together. Lisa blinked back the sting of tears. She squeezed his fingers in return. "Good," she murmured. "Because I was never going to let you leave anyway." Colt chuckled, shaking his head. "Hey, stubborn woman." And then, with the sun rising over Sundown Gulch, painting the town in gold and fire, Liza turned toward the future. Toward home, hand in hand with the man who had fought beside her every step of the way. As the first rays of morning light stretched over the Badlands, Sundown Gulch stood tall and unbroken. It was no longer a place of fear, of corruption. It was a place reborn. Just like her. And as she walked through the town that was hers once more, her heart steady in her chest, she knew this was only the beginning.